Sherlock Holmes and the Wendigo in Whitechapel. A chilling night. Mystery from Baker Street. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the night where stories unfold like mist across cobblestones, and mysteries breathe softly in the darkness. Tonight, we journey together into the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where the rational mind of the world's greatest detective meets something ancient, something that whispers from the shadows of Whitechapel. This is a tale designed to slow your thoughts, to ease the tensions of the day, and to carry you gently into peaceful sleep on the wings of wonder and mystery. Let your breathing deepen, let your muscles soften, and know that here, in this moment, there is nothing required of you but rest. I wonder, as you settle into your pillows tonight, where in this vast world you find yourself. Before sleep takes you, perhaps you might share in the comments what time it is where you are, and from which corner of the globe you listen. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain fell upon London that November evening in 1891, with the persistence of a patient storyteller, each droplet tapping its own small narrative upon the window panes of 221 B. Baker Street. Within that familiar sanctuary of rational thought and tobacco smoke, the fire crackled with a voice all its own, speaking in the ancient language of burning oak and settling coals. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary chair, the leather worn smooth by years of contemplation, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames as though his mind burned with similar intensity. Yet tonight there was something different in his aspect, something almost restful in the way he observed the rain's descent beyond the window. Dr. John Watson occupied the chair opposite, a book resting open upon his lap, though his attention had drifted from its pages to the comfortable silence that filled the room like an old friend. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked with gentle assurance, measuring time in a rhythm that seemed designed to ease rather than hurry, and the scent of Mrs. Hudson's evening tea still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the ever-present aroma of Holmes's pipe tobacco, that particular blend he favoured, rich and earthy, with notes of latakia that curled through the atmosphere like silk ribbons. "Peaceful, is it not, Watson?" Holmes murmured, his voice barely rising above the whisper of rain, each word shaped with care, as though he were reluctant to disturb the evening's tranquillity. London rests tonight beneath her blanket of clouds and rain, and even the criminal classes, it seems, prefer their firesides to their usual nocturnal enterprises. Watson smiled, adjusting his position in his chair, feeling the warmth of the fire upon his face, the comfort of wool against his shoulders. A welcome respite, Holmes. These past months have been rather more eventful than even you might prefer. A quiet evening is precisely what the physician orders, particularly for you. Quite so, Holmes agreed, reaching for his pipe, where it rested upon the small table beside him, the movement slow and deliberate, almost meditative. He did not immediately light it, but simply held it, turning it between his fingers as one might turn over thoughts, examining them from various angles. Though I confess, my dear fellow, that the absence of intellectual stimulation does create a certain restlessness. The mind, you understand, requires its exercise as surely as the body requires its rest. The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and Watson turned a page of his book, though he had not truly read the previous one. Outside, a hansom cab past in the street below, its wheels making that particular wet, rolling sound against rain-slicked cobbles, the horse's hooves creating a rhythm that was almost musical, almost hypnotic, fading gradually into the distance until only the rain remained, constant and soothing in its persistence. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs were so familiar that neither man particularly noted them until she appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with fresh tea, the china rattling gently as she crossed to the table. "Thought you gentlemen might appreciate something warm," she said, her voice carrying that practical kindness that made Baker Street feel less like lodgings and more like home. "Dreadful weather for mid-November, though I suppose we must be grateful it is not snow." "Your timing, as always, Mrs. Hudson, is impeccable," Watson said, setting aside his book to assist with the tea things. The familiar ritual of pouring, of measuring milk and sugar, actions performed so many times they required no thought, leaving the mind free to wander, to drift. Holmes accepted his cup with a nod of thanks, cradling it between his palms, absorbing its warmth. The steam rose in lazy spirals, catching the firelight, creating tiny shifting patterns in the air. He sipped slowly, thoughtfully, his gaze returning to the rain streaked window, where the gaslight from the street lamp below cast wavering shadows upon the glass. Shadows that moved and danced like living things, though of course they were merely the product of rain and light and the physics of refraction. Mrs. Hudson had just descended the stairs, her footsteps growing fainter, when new steps began their ascent, heavier, more urgent, though still restrained, measured. Both Holmes and Watson turned their attention to the doorway, the detective's eyes sharpening with that peculiar intensity that transformed his entire bearing. Though he remained seated, remained outwardly calm. A knock came upon the door, firm but not aggressive, the knock of someone who had been taught proper manners, but whose purpose could not be entirely concealed by courtesy. "Come," Holmes called, his voice carrying easily despite its moderate volume. The door opened to reveal a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and lean, with the weathered complexion of one who spent considerable time outdoors, his clothing suggesting comfortable means, though nothing ostentatious. A scholar perhaps, or a gentleman farmer. His hat dripped steadily onto the landing, and his coat bore the darkened patches of thorough soaking, despite what must have been his best efforts to remain dry. His eyes, however, drew immediate attention, deep-set and troubled, carrying within them something that might have been fear, or perhaps wonder, or perhaps some complex mingling of both emotions that had no simple name. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the visitor asked, though the question was merely formality, for clearly he knew to whom he spoke. "I apologize for the lateness of the hour, but I was told, that is, I have heard, that you are a man who investigates matters that others might dismiss as impossible, as beyond the realm of rational explanation." Holmes gestured toward the chair that Mrs. Hudson had momentarily occupied. "Please sit. Remove your coat and hat. Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to pour our guest some tea. He has come some distance, I perceive, and his journey has been troubled by more than mere weather." The detective's fingers returned to their steepled position, his expression one of polite attention, though Watson could see the quickening of interest in his friend's eyes, that particular alertness that came when a puzzle presented itself. The visitor divested himself of his wet outer garments, hanging them carefully upon the hooks by the door, before settling into the offered chair. with visible relief. He accepted the tea with both hands, as though drawing not merely warmth from the cup, but also courage. And for a long moment he simply sat, gathering his thoughts, while Holmes waited with that infinite patience he could demonstrate when he chose, saying nothing, allowing the silence to extend, to deepen, broken only by the rain and the fire and the gentle ticking of the clock. "My name," the man began at last, his voice soft but steady, "is Professor Edmund Blackwood, lately of Cambridge University, where I hold a chair in anthropology and the study of folklore traditions across various cultures. My work has taken me to many remote corners of the world, Mr. Holmes, places where the old ways persist, where stories are not merely entertainment but living memory, passed down through generations with all the solemnity of sacred trust." He paused to sip his tea, and Watson found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the narrative despite himself, while Holmes remained perfectly still, his grey eyes fixed upon their visitor with unwavering attention. "3 weeks ago," Blackwood continued, setting his cup carefully upon its saucer, the china making a small, clear sound, "I returned to London from an expedition to the Northern Territories of Canada, where I had been studying the legends and traditions of the indigenous peoples of that vast wilderness. Among the many fascinating traditions I encountered, none was more pervasive, more deeply embedded in the culture than the stories of the Wendigo. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, and even the fire seemed to burn more quietly in its wake. Watson felt a small shiver pass along his spine, though whether from the word itself or merely the way Blackwood had spoken it, with such weight, such gravity, he could not say. Holmes's expression did not change, though one eyebrow lifted fractionally. "The Wendigo," he repeated, his voice neutral, inviting elaboration. "I have encountered references to this entity in my readings. A creature of Native American and First Nations mythology, associated with winter, with famine, with the corruption of the human spirit into something monstrous and insatiable. Cannibalism features prominently in the legends, if I recall correctly." "Indeed," Blackwood confirmed, nodding slowly. "The Wendigo is said to be a malevolent spirit that can possess human beings, transforming them into creatures of endless hunger, particularly for human flesh. The very concept embodies the ultimate taboo, the final dissolution of humanity into base appetite. Among the Algonquian peoples, the fear of the Wendigo is profound and real, Mr. Holmes. Not merely a fireside tale, but a psychological and spiritual reality that shapes behavior and reinforces the bonds of community against the terrible isolation that can lead to such transformation." Watson shifted in his chair, feeling the warmth of the room more keenly now, as though the cosy sanctuary of Baker Street had become more precious, more necessary in the face of such dark knowledge. He reached for his own tea, found it had grown lukewarm, but drank anyway, the familiar taste grounding him. Outside, the rain continued its patient percussion, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, the sound muffled and dreamlike through the weather. Part 2. Professor Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup in slow, circular motions, the gesture seemingly unconscious, born of nervous energy seeking outlet through repetition. The firelight carved deep shadows beneath his cheekbones, making him appear older than his years, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to little more than a murmur, as though the very walls might carry his words to unwanted listeners. During my time in the Northern Territories, I collected extensive notes, recordings of oral traditions, sketches of symbolic representations found in remote settlements. The Wendigo, I came to understand, was not simply a monster in the conventional sense, but rather a manifestation of a very real psychological phenomenon, what some have termed Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome wherein individuals become consumed by an overwhelming compulsion toward cannibalism, even when other food sources remain available. The winter isolation, the endless white landscape, the grinding cold that seems to seep into the very soul, all these elements create conditions under which the human mind might fracture in most particular ways. Holmes had retrieved his pipe now, and was methodically filling it with tobacco, his movements slow and precise, creating their own meditative rhythm. He tamped the mixture gently, struck a match, and applied the flame with care, drawing upon the stem until the tobacco caught and began to glow. The smoke rose in a thin stream, adding its scent to the atmosphere of the room, and he spoke through the fragrant haze with characteristic clarity. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective, certainly, Professor. The intersection of environmental pressure, cultural belief, and psychological response. However, I sense that you have not ventured out on such an inclement evening merely to discuss academic theory. Something has occurred, something specific, that has brought you to my door, seeking not a lecture hall, but a consulting detective. A log shifted in the fireplace, settling deeper into the grate with a soft, crumbling sound, sending up a small constellation of sparks that died almost immediately, their brief lives measured in heartbeats. Blackwood watched the fire for a moment, seeming to gather his resolve, and then met Holmes's gaze directly. Upon my return to London, I took rooms in Whitechapel, near the hospital, where I volunteer my services to the less fortunate of that district. My research, you understand, extends beyond the purely academic. I believe that understanding traditional cultures and their methods of addressing psychological distress might offer insights applicable to modern medicine. Whitechapel, with its poverty, its desperation, seemed an appropriate place to explore such theories, to see if the wisdom of ancient peoples might bring comfort to those whom modern society has abandoned. Watson found himself nodding, recognizing in Blackwood's words the same impulse that had driven him to serve in Afghanistan, to practice medicine among soldiers and civilians alike, the desire to be of use, to apply knowledge in service of genuine need. He refilled his own teacup, the sound of liquid pouring into porcelain somehow comforting, domestic, a reminder of civilization and order in the face of darker subjects. 2 weeks ago, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a strained quality now, the words coming more quickly, though still softly. The disappearances began. At first, merely street children, those forgotten souls who inhabit the shadows of London's poorest district, sleeping in doorways, begging for pennies, their absence noted by few and mourned by fewer still. But then others vanished as well. A crossing sweeper, a flower girl, an elderly man who had survived the Crimean War, only to end his days in a rented corner of a common lodging house. 7 people in total, Mr. Holmes, over the course of 10 days, all from within a 6-block radius of my lodgings. The detective had been listening with that peculiar stillness that indicated complete absorption, his pipe forgotten in his hand, the tobacco smouldering untended. Now he stirred, reaching for a notebook that lay upon the table beside him, flipping it open to a fresh page. The authorities have been notified, I presume. Scotland Yard has been informed, yes, though Inspector Lestrade tells me that disappearances in Whitechapel are regrettably common, that poverty and desperation drive many to flee their circumstances, to seek fortune elsewhere, or simply to succumb to the Thames in moments of final despair. He has promised to investigate, but I sense his resources are limited, his attention divided among countless other matters demanding resolution. Holmes made a note with his pencil, the scratching sound distinct in the quiet room. Lestrade is a competent officer within the bounds of conventional crime, but he lacks imagination for cases that venture beyond the ordinary. You believe these disappearances are connected to your studies of the Wendigo legend, Professor. Why? The question hung between them, direct and unavoidable, and Blackwood set down his teacup with enough force that the china rattled against the saucer, his composure cracking slightly to reveal the fear beneath. When he spoke, his words tumbled forth with greater urgency, the dam of professional restraint finally breaking under pressure of genuine terror. Because I have seen the marks, Mr. Holmes. 3 nights ago, I was walking through one of the narrow alleyways near my lodgings, returning from an evening clinic, when I discovered blood upon the cobblestones, still fresh enough to glisten in the gaslight. The pattern was unmistakable to one who has studied such things. Claw marks, gouged into the brick wall above the bloodstain, 5 parallel scratches each, perhaps 4 inches long, carved with such force that fragments of brick had been torn away. And beside the blood, pressed into a patch of mud that had accumulated in a depression between stones, a footprint. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, knuckles white with tension. Outside, the wind had risen slightly, causing the rain to strike the windows with increased force, a sound like fingers tapping, seeking entrance. The footprint was human in general structure, Mr. Holmes, but elongated, perhaps 13 inches in length, with marks where claws rather than toenails had pressed into the mud. And the stride, when I followed the trail for several yards before it disappeared onto paving stones, the stride was impossibly long, 8 feet between prints, suggesting something that moved with supernatural speed, or with legs far longer than any human possesses. Watson felt his medical training asserting itself, seeking rational explanation. Could this not be an elaborate hoax, Professor? Someone aware of your studies, seeking to disturb you, perhaps to gain notoriety, or simply to cause mischief? The carving of false claws onto shoes would not be difficult for anyone with basic carpentry skills. I considered that possibility, Dr. Watson, and would have embraced it gladly were it not for what I found the following morning. Blackwood reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded handkerchief, which he opened with trembling fingers to reveal a small object that caught the firelight with a dull gleam. This was discovered on my doorstep at dawn, placed with deliberate care upon the threshold, where I could not fail to encounter it. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace, crossing to examine the object more closely. Watson joined him, peering over his friend's shoulder at what lay within the handkerchief's folds. It was a bone, small and delicate, unmistakably human, perhaps from a finger or toe. But what arrested attention was not the bone itself, but what had been carved upon its surface. Symbols, intricate and strange, wound around the bone in a spiral pattern, each mark cut with precision and evident care. These markings, Holmes murmured, producing a magnifying lens from his pocket, and examining the bone with minute attention. Are they consistent with the symbolic language you encountered in your research, Professor? They are, Blackwood confirmed, his voice barely audible now. They represent hunger, winter, and transformation. Together, they form a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The Wendigo, according to legend, marks its territory, claims its hunting grounds. These symbols tell other creatures of power that this place belongs to something ancient and terrible, that trespassers do so at mortal peril. The clock struck 10:30, each chime falling into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of awareness that marked time's passage. Holmes returned to his chair, the bone held carefully in his handkerchief, his expression thoughtful but not troubled, the rational mind already beginning to construct frameworks for understanding, pathways toward solution. You have acted wisely in bringing this matter to my attention, Professor Blackwood, he said, his voice resuming its customary measured tone. Whether we are dealing with an elaborate hoax, a deranged individual suffering from the very psychosis you have studied, or something that defies conventional explanation, the pattern suggests intelligence, purpose, and escalating boldness. The placement of this bone upon your doorstep is particularly significant. You are being watched, your movements tracked, your habits studied. Whoever or whatever is responsible has marked you specifically. Watson felt a chill despite the fire's warmth, and he moved to add another log to the grate, using the poker to arrange the burning wood, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room with increased brightness before settling back to steady glow. What would you have us do, Holmes? Surely the man requires protection. Protection, yes, but also investigation, Holmes replied, steepling his fingers once more. Professor, I must ask you to recall every detail of your time in Whitechapel, everyone you have encountered, every conversation, every observation, no matter how seemingly trivial. Often, the key to such mysteries lies not in the dramatic events, but in the small anomalies, the details that seemed unremarkable at the time, but which, when viewed through the lens of subsequent developments, reveal patterns previously invisible. Blackwood nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly, now that he had shared his burden, now that the problem had been transferred to more capable hands. There was one individual who drew my attention, though I cannot say precisely why. A man who frequents the area near the 10 Bells public house, always alone, always watching, tall and terribly thin, with eyes that seemed to reflect light strangely, almost like an animal's eyes caught by lamplight. He wears a long coat, dark and weathered, and moves with peculiar fluidity, as though his joints bend in ways human joints should not. Have you attempted to speak with this individual? Once, yes, several days ago. I approached him, intending to offer assistance, thinking perhaps he was ill or in need. But as I drew near, he smiled at me, Mr. Holmes, and his teeth were filed to points, every one of them creating a mouthful of needle-sharp fangs. He spoke no word, simply smiled, and then walked away, disappearing into the fog with such speed that I could not follow, could not determine which direction he had taken. The rain had eased somewhat, falling now with gentler persistence, and through the window the lights of London glowed soft and blurred, each lamp haloed by moisture, creating islands of illumination in the darkness. Holmes sat in contemplation, smoke rising from his pipe in lazy spirals, his mind clearly working through the information presented, constructing theories, discarding impossibilities, seeking the thread that would lead to understanding. Part 3. The morning arrived wrapped in fog, that peculiar London fog which seemed less a weather phenomenon and more a living presence, pressing against windows, muffling sounds, transforming familiar streets into landscapes of mystery and suggestion. Watson woke to find Holmes already dressed, standing at the window of their sitting room, gazing down into Baker Street, where the lamplighters were making their rounds, extinguishing the gaslights one by one as dawn struggled to assert itself through the heavy grey atmosphere. The detective had not slept. Watson could tell from the set of his shoulders, from the scattered pages of notes covering the table, from the cold remains of coffee in multiple cups, testimony to nocturnal vigil. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said, without turning from the window, his voice showing no evidence of fatigue despite the sleepless night. "I trust you rested adequately. We have considerable work ahead of us today, and I shall require your presence for all of it." Professor Blackwood departed around 3 o'clock this morning, after providing extensive details of his time in Whitechapel, his lodgings, and his observations. I have arranged for him to stay elsewhere for the time being, with friends in Kensington, well away from whatever is unfolding in the East End. Watson crossed to the breakfast table, where Mrs. Hudson had laid out their morning meal, pouring tea that steamed invitingly in the cool room, the warmth a comfort against the damp chill that seemed to permeate everything. "You have formed some theory, then, regarding this business?" Holmes finally turned from the window, his grey eyes bright with that particular intensity that came when a problem engaged his full attention. He moved to join Watson at the table, taking his seat with economical grace, helping himself to toast, which he buttered absently while speaking. Several theories, in fact, ranging from the prosaic to the fantastical, and the truth, as is so often the case, likely resides somewhere between the extremes. What we are dealing with, Watson, is either a remarkably sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to exploit superstition and fear, or we are confronting something that exists at the very boundaries of rational explanation. You cannot seriously entertain the possibility of an actual supernatural entity, Watson said, though his tone carried less certainty than his words suggested. Years of association with Holmes had taught him that the impossible, once all other explanations were eliminated, sometimes had uncomfortable ways of asserting its reality. "I entertain all possibilities until evidence demands I discard them," Holmes replied, crunching his toast thoughtfully. "However, I note that Professor Blackwood's arrival in Whitechapel preceded the disappearances by mere days. This suggests either remarkable coincidence, which I distrust on principle, or a connection between his presence and the subsequent events. Someone, or something, knew of his expertise in Wendigo mythology. Someone sought either to frighten him specifically, or to create a tableau that would inevitably draw his attention, knowing his background would lead him to certain conclusions. The fog outside pressed thicker against the windows now, reducing visibility to mere yards, and the sounds of the waking city came muffled and distant. The clip of hooves, the cry of vendors, the rumble of carts, all softened and strange. Watson found himself thinking of the northern wilderness Blackwood had described, those vast white expanses where humans were small and vulnerable, where ancient fears had taken physical form in legend and perhaps in truth. "We shall visit Whitechapel this morning," Holmes continued, rising from the table to gather various items he deemed necessary for the expedition. His magnifying glass, a measuring tape, vials for collecting samples, a notebook fresh and ready for observations. I wished to examine the scene where Blackwood discovered the blood and footprints, to inspect his lodgings, and to make discreet inquiries among the local population. The East End has its own society, its own rules and hierarchies, and information flows through channels invisible to outsiders. Fortunately, I have cultivated certain connections in that district that may prove valuable. Within the hour, they had departed Baker Street, travelling by hansom through fog-shrouded streets, the horses' hooves creating a steady rhythm against the cobbles. A sound that Watson had always found soothing, meditative almost, the pace of it suggesting unhurried progress through the world. The driver sat hunched against the weather, his cape darkened with moisture, calling occasionally to his horse in a low voice full of affection and encouragement. The city moved past them like a dream, buildings emerging from fog only to be swallowed again, people appearing as shadows before resolving into solid form and then fading once more. As they travelled eastward, the character of the streets transformed gradually, the prosperous squares giving way to narrower lanes. The well-maintained facades replaced by buildings showing their age and wear. Windows patched with newspaper. Doorways crowded with those seeking shelter from the penetrating damp. Whitechapel had always carried a particular atmosphere, Watson reflected, a sense of lives lived at the margins, of survival measured day by day, yet also a stubborn vitality, a refusal to surrender, despite circumstances that might crush the spirit. The cab deposited them at the corner of Commercial Street and Fashion Street, Holmes paying the driver and requesting he return in 2 hours. The fog here seemed even thicker, or perhaps it was simply that the narrow streets and tall buildings trapped it, creating corridors of grey through which they walked with careful attention to their footing. Holmes moved with purpose, clearly having memorized the directions Blackwood had provided, turning down an alley so narrow that Watson could extend his arms and nearly touch both walls simultaneously. "Here," Holmes said, stopping before a section of brick wall that showed, even through the fog's obscuring veil, clear signs of violence. The scratches Blackwood had described were immediately visible, 5 parallel gouges running diagonally across the bricks, each cut deep enough that fragments of masonry had been displaced, creating rough channels that water had filled and darkened. Holmes produced his magnifying glass, examining the marks with minute care, his face inches from the wall, oblivious to the damp that immediately began to soak into his coat. Watson kept watch at the alley's entrance, observing the occasional passer-by, none of whom paid them particular attention. A woman with a basket of wilted flowers offered her wares in a voice hoarse from years of London fog. 2 children, barefoot despite the cold, chased each other past with shrieks of laughter that echoed strangely in the confined space. An old man pushed a cart loaded with racks, the wheels squeaking rhythmically, his progress slow but steady. "Curious," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson. "The marks show no hesitation, no trial scratches. They were made with single, confident strokes, with considerable force applied. Note also the spacing between them, Watson. Come, observe closely." Watson joined his friend at the wall, peering through the magnifying glass Holmes offered. The scratches were indeed remarkably uniform, the spacing between them precise, suggesting either careful measurement or, more disturbingly, natural consistency. The spacing of actual claws rather than artificial implements. Could a person wearing some form of glove fitted with blades create such marks? Watson asked, voicing the rational explanation, even as he felt its inadequacy. Possibly, Holmes conceded, straightening and moving to examine the ground where Blackwood had reported seeing blood. The rain of recent days had washed away most evidence, but Holmes knelt regardless, running his fingers over the cobblestones, feeling for texture, for traces invisible to casual observation. However, the depth and angle of the gouges suggest tremendous strength, applied with precision. A person would need to strike the wall with great force, yet there are no impact marks surrounding the scratches, no signs of preliminary blows or missed attempts. These were made deliberately, almost casually, as though carving brick were no more difficult than marking soft wood. A door opened somewhere nearby, releasing a gust of warm air and the smell of boiling cabbage, and then closed again, the sound flat and final in the fog. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees, his expression thoughtful but not troubled. He seemed energized by the mystery, Watson noted, the intellectual challenge driving away any fatigue from the sleepless night. They proceeded deeper into Whitechapel, Holmes navigating the warren of streets with confidence, occasionally pausing to examine a doorway, a window, an area where shadows gathered thickly even in daylight. They passed the 10 Bells public house, its windows glowing warmly despite the early hour, voices and laughter spilling out whenever the door opened to admit or release patrons. Holmes glanced at the establishment, but did not enter, instead turning down another narrow passage that seemed to lead nowhere, but which opened eventually into a small courtyard surrounded by dilapidated buildings that leaned against each other like weary travellers. Professor Blackwood's lodgings are on the 3rd floor of that building, Holmes said, gesturing toward the most decrepit of the structures, its facade stained with years of soot and rain, its windows uniformly dark. He rented 2 rooms from a widow who lives on the ground floor, a Mrs. Abernathy, who by all accounts keeps to herself and asks no questions of her tenants, a quality much valued in this district. They climbed the narrow staircase, the wood creaking beneath their weight, the air growing progressively colder as they ascended, as though heat could not be bothered to rise this high. The 3rd floor landing was barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast, and the door to Blackwood's rooms stood slightly ajar, moving gently in a draught that came from some unseeable source. Holmes pushed the door fully open with his walking stick, revealing a small sitting room, furnished simply but with evident care. Books lined makeshift shelves, constructed from planks and bricks, their titles suggesting scholarly pursuits, anthropological texts, folklore collections, journals in multiple languages. A desk stood beneath the single window, its surface covered with papers, sketches, and what appeared to be maps marked with various notations. The remains of a fire sat cold in the small grate, and the air held that particular chill of spaces long unheated. Blackwood departed in haste, Holmes observed, moving to the desk where he began examining the papers with systematic attention, touching nothing but observing everything, his eyes scanning each page with remarkable speed and retention. Yet, despite his fear, he took care to organize his materials. These are not the actions of a man in blind panic, but rather of a scholar maintaining professional standards even under duress. Watson moved to examine the bookshelf, reading titles, noting the range of subjects covered. Part 4. The books spoke of distant lands and forgotten peoples, of rituals performed beneath northern lights and ceremonies conducted in languages that predated written history. Watson pulled one volume from the shelf, its leather binding worn smooth by handling, and opened it carefully to reveal hand-drawn illustrations of symbols similar to those carved upon the bone Blackwood had presented the previous evening. The artistry was crude, but effective, each symbol seeming to carry weight beyond its simple lines, suggesting meanings that words alone could not capture. Holmes had moved to the window now, examining the frame with particular attention, running his fingers along the sill where Watson could see faint marks in the accumulated dust. Drag marks, perhaps, or the traces of something having pressed against the wood. The detective produced a small brush from his pocket and carefully collected samples of what appeared to be dark fibres caught in a splinter, depositing them into one of his vials with the care of a jeweller handling precious stones. "Someone has entered through this window," Holmes announced, his voice quiet but certain. "Recently, within the past week, I should estimate, based on the freshness of these marks. The window was forced from the outside, though with remarkable care, minimal damage to the frame. Note how the catch has been bent slightly, just enough to allow the latch to be manipulated from without, yet not so much as to be immediately obvious to someone opening the window from inside during the day." Watson joined him at the window, peering down into the courtyard 3 stories below, seeing nothing but fog and the vague shapes of refuse bins and scattered debris. How could anyone reach this height? There is no drain pipe, no convenient ledge, no apparent means of ascent. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, leaning out the window to examine the brickwork above and to either side. Yet someone, or something, managed the feat. "See here, Watson, these marks on the brick, similar in character to those we observed in the alley, though smaller, more delicate. Something climbed this wall using claws or implements that functioned as such, finding purchase where a normal human climber would find none. The fog swirled below them, moved by winds they could not feel at this height, creating patterns that seemed almost purposeful, almost alive." Watson felt a creeping unease, a sensation he recognized from his military service, that primal awareness of being observed, of standing in the sights of an unseen watcher. He stepped back from the window, and Holmes, as though sensing his friend's discomfort, straightened and returned to his examination of the room's interior. "Let us consider what we know," Holmes said, beginning to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice falling into that lecturing tone he adopted when organizing thoughts aloud. 7 individuals have vanished from this district over 10 days. All were vulnerable, marginalized people whose absence would raise little immediate alarm. Professor Blackwood arrives in Whitechapel and takes these lodgings. Shortly thereafter, the disappearances begin. Blackwood discovers evidence suggesting something monstrous, something that corresponds precisely with his area of academic expertise. He finds a carved bone upon his doorstep, a warning or challenge. His rooms are entered by someone or something capable of scaling a sheer brick wall. A mysterious figure with filed teeth is observed in the vicinity. Holmes paused beside the desk, his fingers drumming lightly upon its surface, creating a soft rhythm that was almost musical. Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly, allowing pale sunlight to filter through in diffuse rays that turned the courtyard below into a study in grey and silver, beautiful in its melancholy way. "We might conclude," he continued, "that Blackwood himself is responsible, creating an elaborate fiction to draw attention to his work, to provide dramatic validation for theories that might otherwise be dismissed as academic fancy. However, his fear was genuine. I am quite certain of that. The physiological responses cannot be easily falsified by even the most accomplished actor. His pupils dilated appropriately, his pulse rate elevated, his hands trembled with authentic terror. No, Blackwood is a victim here, not a perpetrator, though whether a victim of human malice or something less easily categorized remains to be determined." Watson had moved to examine a trunk that sat in the corner, its lid closed but not locked. With a glance at Holmes for permission, he opened it to reveal clothing, travel gear, and beneath these practical items, bundles of papers tied with string, each bundle labelled in Blackwood's neat hand. He lifted one bundle, reading the label, "Testimonies, Northern Territory, December 1890 to March 1891. "Holmes, these might prove illuminating," Watson said, carrying the bundle to the desk, where better light made reading possible. He untied the string and began sorting through pages covered in Blackwood's handwriting, accounts transcribed from oral interviews, stories told in the long darkness of Arctic winter, tales of hunger and desperation, and the terrible transformations that could overcome those who surrendered to the most forbidden of appetites. One account in particular arrested Watson's attention, and he read aloud, so Holmes might hear. The hunter, Joseph Whitefeather, aged 62, spoke of his grandfather's encounter with a Wendigo during the winter of 1807. The creature had once been a man, a trapper named Robert Mackenzie, who became lost during a blizzard and was not found until spring. When he returned to the settlement, those who saw him said his eyes had changed, that he moved too quickly, that his shadow fell wrong upon the snow. He took to wandering at night, and children began to vanish. The elders tracked him to a cave where they found evidence of his crimes. They performed the necessary rituals and burned his body. But Whitefeather's grandfather insisted that the Wendigo spirit could move between hosts, that destroying one body merely forced it to seek another, that such entities were patient and cunning, waiting decades or even centuries for the proper circumstances to manifest again. The room fell silent after Watson finished reading, the weight of the account settling over them like the fog that still pressed against the windows. Holmes had ceased his pacing and stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, though Watson knew that behind those grey eyes, connections were being forged, patterns recognized, theories constructed and tested at speeds that would leave ordinary minds exhausted. "Fetch that bundle there, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to another tied collection of papers, the one labelled Symbolic Systems and Their Interpretations. "I wish to compare the symbols from the bone with Blackwood's research materials." Watson retrieved the indicated bundle, and together they spread papers across the desk, creating a reference library of symbols drawn from various indigenous cultures, each accompanied by Blackwood's careful translations and notes. The symbols from the bone appeared among them, though with variations, regional differences that suggested a symbolic language that had evolved over vast distances and time periods while maintaining core meanings. "Here," Holmes said, his finger tracing a particular sequence of symbols in one of Blackwood's sketches. This combination indicates a claiming, a territorial assertion. The Wendigo, according to these notes, marks its hunting ground with such symbols, warning others of its kind. For even among monsters, there are protocols, territories that must be respected. But look at this additional mark, this element that appears on our bone but not in any of Blackwood's collected examples. Watson leaned closer, studying the mark Holmes indicated, a small spiral that wound inward upon itself, growing smaller and tighter until it vanished at an invisible centre. What does it signify? That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover. It is the anomaly, the element that does not fit established patterns, and in my experience, such anomalies often prove to be the key to understanding the entire puzzle. Holmes straightened, rolling his shoulders to release tension, and checked his pocket watch. Our cab will return shortly. I think it time we made inquiries among the local population, particularly those who operate in the shadows, who see what others overlook. They descended the narrow stairs once more, emerging into the courtyard, where the fog had indeed lifted considerably, revealing details previously obscured. Laundry hung on lines strung between buildings, the garments moving slightly in the breeze, and a cat sat on a windowsill, washing itself with methodical attention. The sounds of the district were clearer now, the city's thousand voices blending into that peculiar urban symphony Watson had come to associate with London's essential character. Holmes led them through a series of increasingly narrow passages, each turn taking them deeper into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's back streets. They passed courtyards where women gathered around communal pumps, filling buckets and exchanging gossip in voices that carried clearly in the damp air. Children played elaborate games whose rules seemed known only to themselves, darting between adults with the confidence of small creatures in familiar territory. An old man sat on a doorstep, mending shoes, his hands moving with practiced skill, his eyes watching everything while appearing to notice nothing. At last, they came to a small shop, its window displaying an assortment of items, suggesting a pawnbroker's establishment, though the sign above the door read simply, "Curiosities," in faded gilt letters. Part 5. Holmes opened the door, which announced their entrance with a cheerful tinkling of bells that seemed incongruous with the shop's shadowy interior. The space within was crowded with objects of every conceivable variety, stacked on shelves that reached toward a ceiling lost in gloom, piled in corners where dust motes danced in the thin light filtering through the grimy window. Pocket watches hung from hooks like strange fruit, their ticking creating a discordant temporal symphony. Books leaned in precarious towers, their spines cracked and faded. Jewelry glinted from display cases, each piece carrying the weight of stories untold, of desperation that had forced their owners to part with treasures for coins that would buy perhaps a week's bread. Behind a counter, constructed from what appeared to be a ship's timber, sat a man of indeterminate age, his face deeply lined, his eyes sharp and assessing behind spectacles that magnified them to unsettling proportions. He wore a waistcoat of purple velvet that had seen better decades, and his fingers, long and stained with ink, moved constantly, sorting through a collection of coins, arranging and rearranging them in patterns only he understood. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice surprisingly cultured, carrying traces of education that his current circumstances might suggest he had never possessed. "It has been some months since you graced my establishment. I trust you are well, and your companion, the good doctor, equally so. Isaac, Holmes acknowledged with a slight nod, using no surname, suggesting their relationship existed in that grey area where formality served no purpose. We require information, and I believe you may possess it, or at least know where it might be obtained. There have been disappearances in this district, 7 individuals over 10 days, and circumstances suggesting something unusual in their nature. Isaac's hands stilled in their constant motion, the coins frozen in whatever pattern he had been creating. His magnified eyes studied Holmes with increased intensity, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might carry tales to unwanted ears. Unusual is a word that covers much territory, Mr. Holmes. In Whitechapel, we see things that would give nightmares to those who live in safer districts. Poverty creates its own monsters, desperation its own horrors. But yes, I have heard whispers of these disappearances, and the whispers carry undertones that disturb even those of us who thought ourselves beyond disturbance. Watson found himself drawn to examine a display case containing what appeared to be tribal artifacts, masks carved from wood, their features exaggerated and disturbing, their empty eyes seeming to follow his movement. Beside them lay weapons of unfamiliar design, blades curved in ways that suggested purposes he preferred not to contemplate. A collection of bones, arranged in careful patterns, suggested divination practices from cultures he could not identify. "What manner of whispers?" Holmes asked, his attention fully focused on Isaac, his body still, but his mind clearly racing, processing every nuance of the man's words and manner. Isaac removed his spectacles, polishing them on his waistcoat with slow, deliberate movements, perhaps buying time to consider his words, to weigh what he would share against what he would keep hidden. When he replaced them and met Holmes's gaze once more, Watson saw something in his expression that might have been fear, or perhaps respect, or perhaps merely the careful neutrality of one who survived by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. There is talk of a man, though whether he is truly a man or something wearing a man's shape, opinions differ. He appeared in the district perhaps 3 weeks past, taking a room in one of the lodging houses on Dorset Street, the sort of establishment where landlords ask no questions and tenants expect no amenities beyond a roof that mostly keeps out rain. He keeps to himself during the day, sleeping, some say, though no one has actually seen him sleeping. At night, he walks. The bells above the door tinkled as a customer entered, a woman wrapped in shawls despite the day's relative warmth, her face hidden in shadow. Isaac's expression closed immediately, becoming the professional shopkeeper, and he gestured toward a back room with the slightest movement of his head. Holmes understood, leading Watson through a curtain of beads that clicked and whispered as they passed, into a space even more crowded than the front, filled with larger items awaiting repair or sale, furniture missing legs, paintings with torn canvases, a stuffed owl with one glass eye missing, its remaining eye seeming to watch them with mournful intensity. They waited in silence, Watson's attention drawn to a mirror whose silvering had deteriorated, creating clouds and gaps that made reflections fragmentary and strange. He could hear Isaac conducting business in the front, the murmur of voices, the clink of coins, the rustle of paper, wrapping something purchased. The transaction seemed to last an eternity, though Watson's watch, when he consulted it, suggested mere minutes had passed. Finally, Isaac joined them, pulling the bead curtain closed behind him. the sound like rain on leaves. He moved to a small stove in the corner where a kettle sat, still warm from earlier heating, and began preparing tea with movements that suggested ritual, comfort found in familiar actions. Forgive the interruption. Mrs. Chen comes every Tuesday to sell items her lodgers have abandoned, and she expects certain courtesies. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the walking man. He poured tea into 3 chipped cups, the liquid dark and fragrant, offering them to Holmes and Watson before continuing. He walks the streets at night, always alone, moving with a particular stride that those who have seen him struggle to describe. Too smooth, they say, too fluid, as though his joints move in ways that should not be possible. He favours the darkest streets, the narrowest alleys, places where the gas lamp's reach fails. Some claim to have seen him standing motionless in doorways, watching, always watching, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's eyes. Watson accepted the tea gratefully, finding it strong and bitter, but warming, and cupped it between his palms, absorbing heat into fingers that had grown stiff with cold. The room was unheated, but somehow the tea and the close quarters made it feel less forbidding, created a pocket of warmth and safety in which difficult truths could be shared. "This man," Holmes said, not touching his own tea, but simply holding it as Watson did, perhaps for the same reason. "He has been seen near the locations where people disappeared. Near, yes, and sometimes at those locations shortly before or after the vanishing occurred. A flower girl named Mary Sullivan was last seen on Fashion Street, calling her wares. An hour later, her basket was found overturned, flowers scattered, and a scrap of her shawl discovered snagged on a nail. 3 witnesses, independently questioned, reported seeing the tall man in that vicinity during the relevant time period, though none could say with certainty that they had seen him interact with Mary. Isaac sipped his tea, the steam rising past his spectacles, briefly fogging them before he tilted his head to allow the vapour to escape. But here is the element that has tongues wagging, Mr. Holmes, the detail that transforms mere suspicion into something approaching terror. Those who have come closest to this man, close enough to see his face clearly in lamplight, report that his teeth are filed to points, every one of them creating a mouth full of needles, and his fingernails, which are long and thick and curved like talons, bear marks as though they have been sharpened deliberately, honed to cutting edges. The owl with its single eye seemed to watch them more intently, if such were possible. And Watson found himself thinking of Blackwood's testimony, of the figure near the 10 bells, of legends born in frozen wilderness, now walking through London's most desperate streets. The rational part of his mind sought explanations, cataloguing mental illnesses that might drive someone to such self-mutilation, to such grotesque transformation of the human form. Yet another part, older and less certain, whispered that some things existed beyond the boundaries of comfortable rationality. Holmes had remained perfectly still throughout Isaac's narrative, his tea forgotten, his entire being focused on absorbing information, and now he spoke with careful precision, each word measured. "This man, has he a name? Does he conduct business, speak with others, establish any form of normal human interaction? If he has a name, none know it. He pays his rent in advance, in coins that are old and strange, foreign currency that the landlord accepts only because gold is gold, regardless of what face it bears. He speaks to no one, though some claim to have heard him singing in his room at night. Songs in a language that sounds like wind through winter trees, that makes listeners feel cold no matter how close they stand to their fires. A church bell tolled somewhere in the distance, marking midday, the sound muffled by fog and buildings, but still carrying a note of reassurance, of continuity, of the ordered world continuing its measured progress through time. Watson finished his tea and set the cup carefully on a nearby table, noting how his hand trembled slightly, a physical manifestation of the unease that had been building throughout this investigation. "One more question, Isaac," Holmes said, finally setting aside his own untouched tea. "In your years in this district, in your dealings with all manner of people, have you ever encountered anything that you could not explain through recourse to natural laws, to human psychology and criminality? Have you ever faced something that defied rational understanding?" Part 6. Isaac regarded Holmes for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a physical thing, weighted with considerations that went beyond mere facts, and ventured into territories of belief and experience. His magnified eyes blinked slowly behind their lenses, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality Watson had not heard before, something that might have been sadness, or perhaps simply weariness accumulated over years of witnessing humanity at its most desperate. "I have seen much, Mr. Holmes, that education would tell me cannot be, yet my eyes insist that it was. 20 years I have operated this establishment, and in that time, Whitechapel has shown me faces of reality that polite society pretends do not exist. Not all monsters are metaphorical. Not all darkness is merely the absence of light. There are corners of this city where old things persist, where the modern world has not entirely displaced what came before, where belief has power that your science cannot measure." He moved to a cabinet in the far corner, its wood blackened with age, its brass fittings tarnished to near opacity. From within, he withdrew a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that made Watson's eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them, patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. Isaac opened the box with evident reluctance, revealing contents wrapped in cloth that had once been white, but had yellowed to the colour of old parchment. "This was brought to me 5 years ago by a sailor who had voyaged to the Arctic regions, trading with the indigenous peoples. He was dying, tuberculosis consuming him, and he wished to be rid of this before the end, feared that dying while in possession of it might trap his soul in ways he could not articulate, but deeply felt. I paid him what he asked, which was very little, and I have kept it hidden ever since, uncertain what to do with it, unwilling to destroy it or pass it to another." Isaac unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing an object perhaps 6 inches in length, carved from what appeared to be bone or ivory, its surface covered with symbols similar to those Watson had seen in Blackwood's papers and on the bone left at the professor's doorstep. The carving depicted a figure, humanoid in general structure, but elongated, distorted, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in claws, its mouth open in what might have been a scream or perhaps a howl of hunger. The artistry was remarkable, each detail rendered with painstaking care, yet the overall effect was deeply disturbing, creating visceral discomfort that Watson felt in his stomach, in the primitive parts of his brain that still remembered when humans were prey rather than predators. Holmes reached for the object, then paused, glancing at Isaac. "May I?" Handle it carefully, Mr. Holmes. Those who carved such things believed they held power, that they were not merely representations, but vessels, containers for forces that existed before humans learned to make fire, before we built cities and created laws. The detective took the carving with both hands, holding it up to catch the light filtering through the room's single grimy window. His expression remained neutral, clinical, the scientist observing a specimen. Yet Watson noticed how Holmes's fingers maintained minimal contact with the object, how he held it at arm's length, as though instinctively maintaining distance from something potentially dangerous. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Holmes murmured, his eyes tracing the carved lines, the intricate symbols. Whoever created this possessed both artistic skill and intimate knowledge of the subject matter. This is not crude folklore translated into wood or bone, but rather a precise rendering based on direct observation or deeply held cultural transmission of specific visual information. Note the proportions, Watson, how they deviate from human norms in consistent ways. The legs are approximately 20% longer than standard human proportions would suggest, the torso compressed, the arms extended. If one were attempting to imagine what a human body might look like after transformation by extreme starvation, followed by some form of hypertrophic growth, particularly in the extremities, this would be a reasonable approximation. Watson forced himself to examine the carving more closely, applying his medical training to overcome his visceral revulsion. Holmes was correct. The proportions suggested a body that had undergone radical transformation. Muscle and fat consumed. Bone structure altered through processes he could not imagine, but which the carving depicted with disturbing specificity. "The symbols," Holmes continued, turning the carving to examine all its surfaces, "are consistent with those in Blackwood's research and on the bone we examined. However, there is an additional element here, incorporated into the design around the figure's chest." He indicated a section where the symbols formed a pattern that spiraled inward, growing tighter and smaller until they disappeared into what appeared to be a hollow cavity carved into the figure's torso. Isaac nodded slowly. The sailor who brought this spoke of the Arctic people's belief that the Wendigo has no heart in the conventional sense, that the transformation from human to monster involves the heart turning to ice, becoming a frozen void that can never be filled, that drives the creature's endless hunger. The spiral represents this emptiness, this absence at the core of being. Holmes returned the carving to Isaac, who wrapped it carefully once more in its yellowed cloth and restored it to its box, his hands moving with the practiced care of one, handling something both precious and dangerous. The box returned to its cabinet, the door closed firmly, and Isaac turned back to face them, his expression suggesting both relief at the object's concealment and lingering unease that mere wood and brass could contain what it represented. "If you are hunting what I think you hunt, Mr. Holmes," Isaac said quietly, "you must understand that you are dealing with something that exists at the intersection of psychology, physiology, and belief. Whether the Wendigo is a spirit that possesses humans or a psychosis that transforms them, the end result is functionally identical. A person becomes a monster, driven by hungers that civilization was designed to suppress, acting on impulses that should remain forever buried. And such creatures are cunning, patient, and terribly strong." The church bell tolled again, marking the quarter hour, its sound a reminder of time's passage, of the world beyond this shadowy room continuing its measured progression. Holmes stood silent for a moment, his mind clearly processing everything they had learned, sorting facts from speculation, evidence from supposition, seeking the patterns that would illuminate the path forward. "You have been most helpful, Isaac," Holmes said finally, producing several coins from his pocket and laying them on the table beside the tea things. "If you hear anything further, any additional sightings or information regarding this walking man, please send word to Baker Street immediately. Time may be of considerable importance." They departed the shop, the bells above the door announcing their exit with the same cheerful tinkling that had marked their entrance, emerging into a Whitechapel transformed by the lifting fog. Sunlight, pale and watery, but genuine nonetheless, illuminated the streets with that peculiar clarity that follows prolonged gloom, making everything appear sharper, more defined. People moved with increased energy, as though the improved weather had lifted spirits along with the fog, and the sounds of the district had taken on a more optimistic quality. Vendors calling with greater enthusiasm, children laughing more freely. Holmes set a brisk pace, leading them through streets Watson was beginning to recognize, past landmarks that had become familiar over the course of the morning. They walked in silence for some minutes, Watson content to let his friend think, knowing that Holmes's mind worked best when not interrupted, when allowed to follow its own paths toward conclusions that would eventually be shared. At length, they reached a small park, little more than a patch of grass and a few benches, arranged around a fountain that no longer functioned, its basin dry and filled with fallen leaves. Holmes selected a bench positioned to receive the maximum benefit of the weak sunlight, and they sat, the detective producing his pipe and tobacco pouch, beginning the ritual of preparation that always accompanied his deepest contemplations. "We are dealing," Holmes said as he packed tobacco into the bowl with his thumb, "with either a remarkably sophisticated criminal who has studied anthropological literature extensively and chosen to model his activities on Wendigo mythology, or we are confronting something that exists at the very boundaries of what modern science acknowledges as possible. In either case, the practical approach remains identical. We must locate this individual, observe his habits and patterns, and determine the truth of his nature through direct investigation." Watson watched as Holmes lit his pipe, the match flaring bright in the daylight, the tobacco catching and beginning to smoulder, releasing its familiar scent that Watson had always found oddly comforting. A small dog trotted past, intent on its own business, and somewhere nearby a barrel organ began playing, its mechanical melody adding to the urban symphony. "You believe the disappearances will continue?" Watson said, not quite a question. "I am certain of it. The pattern suggests escalation, increasing frequency and boldness. The placement of the bone at Blackwood's doorstep indicates that whoever is responsible seeks to communicate, to be understood by someone capable of understanding. There is ego here, Watson, pride in the execution of what the perpetrator views as a kind of performance, an artistic expression. Such individuals do not simply cease their activities. They must be stopped, or they will continue until either captured or until their psychological needs have been satisfied, which in cases of this nature often means death, either their own or that of their pursuers." Part 7. The afternoon stretched before them like a path through uncertain territory, and Holmes seemed content to sit in the pale sunlight, smoking his pipe with measured draws, his grey eyes watching the movements of the district, with that peculiar attention he could summon when needed, seeing not merely surfaces, but the stories they concealed. Watson found himself wondering about the people who passed, each absorbed in their own struggles, unaware that something predatory moved among them, that their familiar streets had become hunting grounds for a creature whose nature remained frustratingly ambiguous. A woman pushing a pram stopped briefly at the dry fountain, adjusting blankets around her infant with tender care before continuing on her way. An elderly gentleman fed breadcrumbs to pigeons that gathered in hopeful clusters around his feet, their soft cooing creating a sound like distant conversation. Two young men argued about something Watson could not hear, their gestures animated but not threatening, the sort of disagreement that would resolve itself through words rather than violence. "Tonight," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through Watson's observations, "we shall return to Whitechapel and position ourselves where we can observe Dorset Street and the lodging house where Isaac indicated our mysterious figure has taken residence. I wish to see this man myself, to observe his movements and mannerisms without his awareness of our scrutiny. Human behavior, even when deliberately obscured or modified, reveals patterns that cannot be entirely suppressed. If he is merely a man playing its monster, there will be signs, moments when the performance falters. If he is something else, something that has genuinely transcended normal human limitations, that too will reveal itself through observation." Watson nodded his agreement, knowing that argument would be pointless, and, moreover, knowing that his presence would be both expected and necessary. They had faced danger together too many times for Watson to consider allowing Holmes to venture into potential peril alone. His military training, his medical knowledge, and his steady nerve had proven valuable on countless occasions. And this investigation, whatever its ultimate nature proved to be, would likely require all the resources they could bring to bear. They remained in the small park as the afternoon progressed, Holmes occasionally making notes in his small leather journal, observations and theories committed to paper in his cramped, efficient handwriting. Watson watched the play of light across the buildings as the sun moved toward the horizon, creating shadows that lengthened and deepened, transforming the familiar into something subtly strange, reminding him that perspective, angle, and illumination could make the ordinary appear extraordinary, the known seem unknown. At length they rose, stiffness in Watson's legs reminding him that sitting motionless for extended periods was a young man's game, and began making their way back toward the more prosperous districts where hansom cabs might be hailed. The journey took them through streets that were beginning to prepare for evening, shops closing, workers returning to homes. The city's rhythm shifting from commerce to rest, though in Whitechapel, rest was often a relative term, the night bringing its own activities, its own economy of survival. They returned to Baker Street as dusk was settling over London, the lamplighters making their rounds, touching flame to wicks, creating islands of illumination in the gathering darkness. Mrs. Hudson had prepared dinner, and they ate with good appetite, the day's walking and the cold having generated hunger that the excellent meal satisfied admirably. Holmes spoke little during dinner, his mind clearly still occupied with the case, sorting through information, constructing and discarding theories, approaching the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. After dinner, Watson attended to correspondence that had accumulated, writing letters that required responses, paying bills that demanded attention, maintaining the small administrative requirements of civilized life. Holmes sat in his chair, his violin across his lap, drawing the bow across strings with barely any pressure, creating sounds so soft they were almost subaudible, more vibration than melody, a form of meditation through music that Watson had learned to recognize as indicating deep contemplation. The clock struck 8, its chimes falling into the quiet room like stones into still water, and Holmes set aside his violin with careful attention, returning it to its case with movements that suggested ritual, respect for the instrument that had provided solace during countless investigations. He rose, stretching muscles that had been held too long in one position, and moved to the window, where he stood looking down into Baker Street, watching the evening's activities with that distant expression that meant his mind was elsewhere, planning, anticipating, preparing. "We should depart within the hour," he said, without turning from the window. "I wish to be in position before full darkness falls, to observe the transition from day to night, to see how the district transforms, how its inhabitants adapt to reduced visibility and increased danger. Bring your service revolver, Watson. I do not anticipate violence, but preparedness has never proven disadvantageous in our investigations." Watson felt his pulse quicken slightly, the familiar anticipation that preceded action, the heightened awareness that came from knowing that danger might be encountered, that the comfortable safety of Baker Street would soon be exchanged for the uncertain shadows of Whitechapel's back streets. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was properly loaded, that the mechanism functioned smoothly, the weight of it in his pocket both reassuring and sobering, a reminder that their investigations sometimes required more than intellectual prowess. They dressed warmly, for the night promised to be cold, fog already beginning to form in the streets, rising from the Thames and spreading through the city like a living thing, softening edges, obscuring details, creating that peculiar intimacy that fog brings, reducing the world to arm's length, making every sound seem closer, every shadow potentially inhabited. Holmes wore his heavy coat and wrapped a scarf around his neck, and Watson noted that he too had armed himself, though the detective rarely needed to draw his weapon, his mind and his knowledge of boxing and Japanese wrestling usually proving sufficient for physical confrontations. The cab ride through foggy streets was like travelling through dreams, the familiar landmarks of London appearing and disappearing, transformed by reduced visibility into suggestions of themselves, ghosts of buildings, shadows of streets. The driver navigated with the confidence of long experience, his horse stepping carefully, the hooves creating rhythm against cobblestones, a sound Watson had come to associate with the beginning of adventures, with the moment when theory became practice, when speculation transformed into investigation. They alighted several streets away from their intended destination, Holmes preferring to approach on foot, to arrive from directions that would not draw attention, to blend into the district's natural movement rather than announce their presence. The fog here was thicker, perhaps because the buildings were taller and more closely spaced, creating corridors where moisture collected and lingered, where visibility was measured in yards rather than blocks. Holmes led them through passages Watson would never have found on his own, turning down alleys barely wide enough for a single person, emerging into small courtyards before diving back into narrow ways that seemed to lead nowhere, but which eventually opened onto streets he recognized from their earlier explorations. The detective's knowledge of London's geography was extraordinary, Watson reflected, encompassing not merely the major thoroughfares, but the hidden arteries, the forgotten spaces, the paths that connected the official city with its shadow self. At last, they reached a position across from the lodging house Isaac had mentioned, a building that looked no different from dozens of others in the vicinity. 4 stories of stained brick, windows dark or dimly lit. The sort of structure that held lives lived at the margins, where questions were not asked, and privacy was maintained through mutual disinterest. Holmes positioned them in a doorway that offered both concealment and a clear view of the lodging house entrance, a location chosen with obvious care, and they settled in to watch, to wait, to observe whatever the night might reveal. The street was not empty, for Whitechapel's nights were busy with those whose work began when daylight failed. But the foot traffic was sporadic, individuals moving with purpose, seeking destinations, not lingering in the cold and fog. Part 8. Time moved differently while watching. Watson had learned through numerous investigations, the minutes stretching or compressing, depending on whether something occurred or nothing did, the anticipation creating its own temporal distortions. They stood in their doorway, the cold seeping through their coats, despite the wool's thickness, their breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly into the fog. Holmes remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the lodging house entrance, his patience seemingly infinite, while Watson shifted his weight occasionally, flexing his fingers to maintain circulation, his military training helping him endure the discomfort without complaint. An hour passed, marked by a distant church bell, whose chimes came muffled and strange through the fog. A few residents entered or exited the lodging house, none matching the description of the figure they sought. A woman in a threadbare shawl hurried past, her face hidden, her footsteps quick with either purpose or fear. 2 men stumbled by, clearly drunk, supporting each other with the camaraderie of shared intoxication, singing a song whose words were slurred beyond recognition, but whose melody carried a note of defiant cheerfulness. Then, as the bell was tolling 10:30, the lodging house door opened once more, and a figure emerged that made Watson's breath catch in his throat, made his hand move instinctively toward the revolver in his pocket. The man was tall, extraordinarily so, perhaps 6.5 feet in height. But what arrested attention was not his stature, but his proportions. His limbs seemed too long, his torso too compressed, his movements too fluid, as though his joints bent in ways that human joints should not, creating a gait that was neither quite walking nor quite gliding, but something between, something profoundly wrong, in ways the eye recognized before the mind could articulate. He wore a long coat, dark and weather-stained as Isaac had described, and his head was bare despite the cold, revealing hair that hung long and lank, its colour uncertain in the fog and gaslight. As he passed beneath a street lamp, Watson caught a glimpse of his face, gaunt to the point of emaciation, cheekbones prominent, eyes set deep in their sockets, and even from this distance, even through the obscuring fog, Watson could see that when the figure's lips drew back in what might have been a smile, or simply a stretching of facial muscles, his teeth caught the light with sharp glints, points where rounded edges should be. Holmes's hand gripped Watson's arm, a warning to remain still, to observe rather than act, and together they watched as the tall figure moved down the street with that unsettling gait. covering ground with remarkable speed, despite appearing to move without haste. He turned down an alley, disappearing into darkness, and Holmes immediately moved to follow, gesturing for Watson to maintain distance, to stay several yards behind. They tracked him through Whitechapel's labyrinth, the fog both hindering and helping, reducing visibility, but also providing concealment. The tall figure moved with apparent purpose, taking turns without hesitation, as though following a route he had travelled many times, his destination known and anticipated. Watson's heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline sharpening his senses, making every sound distinct, every shadow potentially significant. The pursuit led them to an area Watson did not recognize, where buildings stood abandoned, windows broken, doors hanging from hinges. The sort of urban decay that occurred when industry moved elsewhere, when prosperity shifted to new districts, leaving behind empty shells that squatters and criminals claimed for their own purposes. The tall figure approached one such building, its facade collapsed partially, revealing interior spaces open to the elements, and paused at what had once been the main entrance. Holmes and Watson pressed themselves against a wall, perhaps 30 yards distant, concealed in shadow, watching as the tall figure stood motionless, his head tilted as though listening, as though sensing something in the fog-thick air. For a long moment he remained thus, and Watson felt certain they had been detected, that their quarry knew of their presence and was deciding how to respond. Then, with movements that seemed impossibly quick, the figure entered the building, disappearing into its dark interior, like smoke drawn into a draught. "We must see where he goes, what he does," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible even at close range. "But carefully, Watson, with extreme caution. If Isaac's information is accurate, if this creature possesses the strength and ferocity attributed to it, direct confrontation would be inadvisable in the extreme." They approached the abandoned building with steps that made no sound, or as little sound as possible on broken ground. Their breath held, their entire beings focused on stealth. The entrance gaped before them like a mouth, darkness within so complete that even their eyes, adjusted to the fog-dimmed gaslight, could discern nothing. Holmes produced a small electric torch from his pocket, one of the newer models that ran on batteries, compact and reliable, though he did not yet activate it, waiting until they had entered, until the light would not be visible from the street. The interior smelled of rot and time, damp plaster and rusted metal, the accumulated decay of years without maintenance. Holmes activated the torch, keeping the beam low, directed at the floor where broken boards and fallen masonry created treacherous footing. They moved deeper into the structure, following a corridor whose walls were stripped of anything valuable, leaving only scarred surfaces and remnants of paper that had once decorated rooms where people worked or lived, pursuing ordinary dreams in spaces now given over to abandonment. A stairway descended into darkness, and from below came sounds, subtle but distinct, a scraping as of metal on stone, a soft rustling that might have been fabric, or might have been something else, something organic. Holmes directed the torch beam down the stairs, revealing steps thick with dust, except where recent passage had disturbed it, creating a trail that led downward into what must be a basement or cellar. They descended with infinite care, testing each step before committing weight to it, the old wood groaning softly despite their caution, sounds that seemed thunderous in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder as they went down, and with the cold came a smell, faint at first, but growing stronger, a charnel odour that Watson recognised from his medical training, from his military service, the unmistakable scent of decay, of flesh no longer living, of death in its various stages. The stairs ended in a large open space, perhaps once a storage cellar or workshop, its ceiling supported by pillars of brick, its floor earthen where boards had been removed or rotted away. Holmes's torch beam swept across the space, revealing details that accumulated into a tableau of horror that would have been unbelievable had Watson not been seeing it with his own eyes. The far wall had been decorated, if such a word could apply, with symbols carved directly into the brick. The same symbols they had seen in Blackwood's research, on the bone, on Isaac's carving. The carvings were fresh, dust from the brickwork still visible on the floor beneath them, suggesting recent creation. But it was what lay arranged before this wall that arrested attention, that made Watson's medical detachment falter, that brought bile rising in his throat. 7 bundles, wrapped in canvas or cloth, each approximately the size of a human body, arranged in a semicircle. And from the bundles came the smell of decay, confirmation of their contents. The tall figure knelt before these bundles, his back to the stairway, his movements suggesting ritual, purpose beyond mere concealment of crimes. He swayed slightly, and from his throat came sounds, rhythmic and strange, words in a language Watson could not identify, consonants harsh and vowels drawn out, creating a chant that was hypnotic and deeply disturbing. Holmes's hand on Watson's shoulder conveyed warning, urging retreat, suggesting they had seen enough, that remaining would serve no purpose beyond increasing danger. Part 9. But as they turned to ascend the stairs, Watson's foot struck a piece of loose masonry that skittered across the floor with a sound like breaking glass in the oppressive silence. The chanting ceased immediately, cut off mid-syllable, and the tall figure rose with a speed that defied natural movement, spinning to face them with fluid grace that suggested a predatory instinct honed over countless hunts. His eyes caught the beam of Holmes's torch and reflected it back, glowing with a greenish luminescence that was utterly inhuman, the eyes of something that saw better in darkness than in light, that belonged to night and shadow rather than to civilized spaces. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they faced each other across the cellar's expanse, Watson's hand finding his revolver, drawing it with movements made automatic by training. Holmes standing perfectly still beside him, the torch beam unwavering despite the danger, illuminating the figure fully now, denying him the concealment of shadow. The creature, for Watson could no longer think of him as simply a man, tilted his head in a gesture that might have been curiosity or calculation, and when he smiled, his filed teeth created a nightmare vision, a mouth designed for tearing rather than speaking. "You have come seeking understanding," the creature said, his voice surprisingly cultured, carrying traces of education that made the contrast with his appearance even more jarring. The detective and his faithful companion, drawn by patterns and mysteries, unable to resist the intellectual puzzle. How very predictable, how very human. Holmes's response came calm and measured, as though they were discussing matters over tea, rather than facing something that radiated menace in the darkness of an abandoned cellar. "You know who we are, which suggests you have been observing us as we have sought to observe you. You placed the bone at Professor Blackwood's doorstep. knowing his expertise would lead him to seek assistance, knowing that such assistance would likely involve my services. You have orchestrated this encounter, drawn us here deliberately. The question becomes, for what purpose? The creature moved closer, each step deliberate, and Watson raised his revolver, sighting along the barrel, his finger on the trigger, though not yet applying pressure. The creature paused, acknowledging the weapon with a slight nod, but without apparent fear, as though the threat it represented was negligible, insufficient to warrant genuine concern. I have walked this earth for longer than your civilization has recorded time, the creature said, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality, almost hypnotic, drawing them into narrative despite the danger. I have worn many faces, inhabited many forms, moved through cultures and centuries, feeding on what sustains me, what I require to continue. The indigenous peoples of the Northern Territories understood. They had names for what I am, rituals to appease or ward against me, respect born of genuine knowledge. But here, in your modern London with its gaslights and railways, and certainty that science has explained all mysteries, here I am merely myth, merely legend, merely impossible. Holmes had lowered the torch slightly, no longer shining it directly into the creature's eyes, perhaps recognizing that blinding him might provoke attack, that allowing him to speak, to explain, served better purposes than immediate confrontation. You are suffering from a form of psychosis, Holmes said, his voice carrying the calm authority of absolute certainty. Wendigo psychosis, specifically, combined with physical modifications you have inflicted upon yourself, filing your teeth, perhaps consuming substances that have altered your metabolism, your body's responses. You believe yourself transformed, possessed, made into something beyond human, but what you actually are is profoundly ill, requiring medical intervention rather than the mythology you have embraced. The creature laughed, a sound without humour, harsh and sharp in the enclosed space. The rational mind, seeking rational explanations, unable to accept what stands before it. Tell me, detective, does your science explain how I have survived 2 centuries? How I have walked through plagues that killed millions, wars that consumed nations, famines that reduced strong men to shadows? Does your rationality encompass the hunger that drives me, that makes ordinary food turn to ash in my mouth, that can only be satisfied through consumption of what your morality declares forbidden? Watson felt his hand steady on the revolver, his medical training asserting itself, noting the creature's dilated pupils, his rapid speech, the slight tremor in his extended fingers, all signs of heightened neurological activity, perhaps induced by drugs, or perhaps symptomatic of genuine mental illness. Yet something in the creature's presence defied easy categorization, created doubt in Watson's mind, despite his commitment to scientific understanding. "The 7 you have taken," Holmes said, gesturing toward the wrapped bundles against the wall. They were vulnerable, isolated, chosen because their disappearance would raise minimal alarm. You are not mindless in your hunger, not driven purely by instinct, but rather calculating, intelligent, selecting victims through careful observation and planning. This suggests retained humanity, retained capacity for thought and reason, which contradicts your claim to be something wholly other. I choose carefully because I am not a monster in the sense you understand, the creature replied, moving to stand beside the bundles, one hand reaching out to touch the nearest. With something that might have been reverence, or perhaps merely satisfaction. These souls were suffering, trapped in lives of grinding poverty and despair, their futures holding nothing but continued agony until death released them. I offered release. I consumed their pain along with their flesh. I gave them purpose beyond mere survival. They sustain me, yes, but I also honor them, mark them with proper ritual, acknowledge their sacrifice. The rationalization was familiar to Watson from his studies of criminal psychology, the construction of moral frameworks that justified acts society deemed heinous, the transformation of predation into something noble, something necessary. Yet even knowing this, even recognizing the pattern, Watson found himself disturbed by the conviction in the creature's voice, the genuine belief that his actions served some higher purpose beyond mere appetite. Holmes had begun moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, angling toward the stairs, creating distance between himself and Watson, dividing the creature's attention, forcing him to choose which threat to monitor more closely. Watson recognized the strategy, had employed it countless times in their joint investigations, the subtle tactical positioning that created advantages, that opened possibilities for escape or intervention. "You have made yourself visible," Holmes said, continuing his slow movement. "Left evidence, drawn attention through your presence and your rituals. This is not the behavior of one who wishes to remain hidden, to continue hunting without interference. You want acknowledgement, recognition, validation that what you are, what you have become, possesses significance beyond personal delusion. You orchestrated this encounter because isolation, even for one who claims to have transcended humanity, becomes unbearable over time." The creature's expression shifted, something flickering across his gaunt features that might have been pain or perhaps recognition of truth spoken. "Centuries alone," he whispered, his voice losing its harsh edge, becoming almost plaintive. "Centuries watching humans live and love and die in their brief spans, unable to join them, unable to cease, locked in this existence that is neither life nor death, but something between, something that endures beyond all reason or desire for endurance." Watson felt an unexpected stirring of compassion, recognizing in the creature's words an expression of profound suffering, of isolation that transcended physical solitude and became existential abandonment. Part 10. The moment stretched between them, fragile and strange, the creature standing among his victims, Holmes and Watson poised between retreat and confrontation. And in that suspension of action, something shifted in the atmosphere of the cellar, as though the very air recognized that resolution approached, that the tension building throughout this investigation was reaching its culmination. Watson's finger remained on the trigger of his revolver, yet he did not fire, held by something in the creature's demeanor, by the vulnerability that had emerged beneath the monstrous exterior. Holmes spoke again, his voice gentler now, taking on the tone he sometimes used with witnesses traumatized by their experiences, victims requiring care as much as information. "If what you say is true, if you have indeed walked through centuries alone, then you possess knowledge, perspective, understanding that could benefit humanity rather than merely feeding upon it. The indigenous peoples you mentioned, they found ways to coexist with the legends of the Wendigo, to acknowledge its existence while protecting themselves through ritual and community. Perhaps there is a path forward that does not require continued killing, continued isolation." The creature regarded Holmes with those luminescent eyes, and Watson saw intelligence there, genuine comprehension struggling against whatever compulsions drove the monstrous behaviour. You offer hope where none has existed, for longer than your language has been spoken, the creature said slowly, each word carefully chosen. But the hunger, detective, the hunger is not merely physical craving, but existential void. Emptiness at the core of being that nothing fills. That consumption temporarily quiets, but never satisfies. I have tried, across decades and centuries, to find other ways, to subsist on animal flesh, to starve myself, hoping that death would finally claim me. But I persist, I endure, and the hunger always returns, always demands satisfaction. Holmes had reached the base of the stairs now, positioning himself where escape remained possible, and he gestured for Watson to move toward him, while keeping his attention focused on the creature. Professor Blackwood studies these phenomena from anthropological and psychological perspectives, Holmes said. He has collected knowledge from cultures that dealt with Wendigo psychosis for generations, treatments and rituals that addressed both the spiritual and physical manifestations. You sought him out, left the bone at his doorstep, because some part of you, the part that retains humanity, desires cure rather than continued existence as monster. The creature turned away from them, facing the wall with its carved symbols, his shoulders slumping in a gesture that conveyed defeat, weariness, the accumulated exhaustion of centuries without rest. I do not know if I can be cured, he said, his voice barely audible now. I no longer know what I am, whether the man I was still exists somewhere within this form, whether redemption remains possible for one who has committed acts that your laws and morality would rightly condemn. But I am tired, detective, so profoundly tired of the hunger, of the isolation, of existing at the margins of a world that has no place for what I have become. Watson found himself lowering his revolver slightly, not holstering it, but no longer aiming directly at the creature, responding to something in the figure's posture, in his words, that spoke of genuine anguish rather than manipulation. He had seen many forms of human suffering in his medical practice, in his military service, but this was suffering of a different order, suffering that transcended physical pain and became spiritual torment, existence without purpose or hope of cessation. Come with us, Holmes said, the words surprising Watson, though he immediately understood their rightness, their necessity. Let us bring you to Blackwood. Let us attempt to understand what you are, what might be done to address your condition. The alternative is continued killing, continued flight, and eventually discovery by authorities less interested in understanding than in execution. You have orchestrated this encounter because you seek resolution, and resolution requires trust, requires vulnerability, requires accepting help from those you have spent centuries fearing or avoiding. The creature remained motionless for a long moment, and Watson could see the struggle playing across his shoulders, the tension of decision, of choice that might determine not merely his fate, but the fates of countless others who might become his victims if he continued his predatory existence. The wrapped bundles against the wall bore silent witness, testament to what he had done, what he might continue to do, the cost of his survival measured in lives that had ended too soon, in suffering that had been transformed into his sustenance, finally, with movements that seemed to require tremendous effort, as though he were fighting against his own nature, against instincts and compulsions that had defined his existence for centuries. The creature turned back to face them, His eyes had lost some of their luminescence, becoming more human, more vulnerable. And when he spoke, his voice carried resignation, acceptance, perhaps even relief. "I will come," he said simply, "not because I believe cure is possible, but because I can no longer bear the alternative, because even monsters, it seems, can reach limits of what they can endure. The hunger will return, understand that, and when it does, I may become dangerous regardless of intention or desire. But for now, in this moment, I choose to trust, to hope, to believe that your offer comes from genuine desire to help rather than merely to capture." Holmes nodded, his expression revealing nothing of whatever emotions he might feel, maintaining the professional detachment that allowed him to function effectively in situations that would overwhelm ordinary sensibilities. "We will take you to a safe location, somewhere secure where Blackwood can examine you, where we can begin attempting to understand your condition without risk to yourself or others. Watson, keep your weapon ready, but holstered unless circumstances demand otherwise. Our friend here has made a choice, and we must honor that choice while remaining appropriately cautious." They ascended the stairs in procession, the creature moving between them, his unusual gait making soft sounds against the old wood, and emerged into the abandoned building's ground floor, where fog had drifted in through broken windows, creating swirling patterns in the beam of Holmes's torch. The journey back through Whitechapel's streets was surreal. 3 figures moving through fog. One of them, something that existed at the boundaries of myth and reality, heading toward uncertain resolution of mysteries that challenged comfortable certainties. Watson found himself thinking of all they had learned, of the journey from Blackwood's arrival at Baker Street, through investigations and revelations, to this strange exodus, and he marveled at how the world continued to surprise, to present challenges that defied easy categorization, that required open minds and willing hearts alongside rational analysis. The creature walked beside them with increasing weariness, as though the decision to surrender, to seek help, had depleted reserves that had sustained him through his terrible existence. They reached Baker Street as dawn was beginning to break, the fog thinning as sunlight struggled to assert itself, creating that liminal time between night and day, when the city seemed to hold its breath, pausing between darkness and light. Mrs. Hudson, accustomed to their irregular hours, made no comment when they entered with their unusual companion, though Watson saw her eyes widen slightly before professional discretion reasserted itself, and she retired to prepare breakfast, understanding without being told that questions could wait. The creature, ensconced in Holmes's chair by the fireplace, where coals still glowed from the previous evening, seemed to diminish somehow, to become less monstrous and more pitiable, a being trapped by circumstances beyond his control or understanding, seeking relief from burdens that had crushed any joy from existence. Holmes sent word to Professor Blackwood, and within hours the scholar had arrived, his face showing recognition when he saw the creature, confirmation that this was indeed the figure he had observed, the walking man whose presence had heralded disappearances and mysteries. What followed were days of examination, of careful documentation, of attempts to understand through science and anthropology what existed at the intersection of psychology, physiology, and belief. Blackwood worked tirelessly, consulting his research, corresponding with colleagues across continents, seeking traditional knowledge that might offer insights Western medicine had overlooked. The creature whom they learned had once been called Thomas Whitmore, a sailor who had survived a shipwreck in Arctic waters in the year 1793, cooperated fully, submitting to examinations and interviews with the patience of one who had nothing left to lose, who had surrendered hope of normal existence, but still clung to possibility of understanding. The hunger, when it returned, was managed through methods suggested by indigenous healers Blackwood contacted, rituals that addressed spiritual dimensions alongside physical needs, treatments that acknowledged the condition's complexity without attempting to reduce it to simple explanations. It was not cure, perhaps could never be complete cure, but it was management, containment, transformation of monster back toward man through patient application of knowledge accumulated across cultures and centuries. As weeks passed into months, Watson watched Whitmore change, not physically, but in demeanour, in the way he carried himself, in the gradual emergence of the person he had been before transformation, before the terrible hunger had consumed his humanity. There were setbacks, moments when the creature threatened to overwhelm the man, when isolation became necessary for everyone's safety. But these episodes grew less frequent, less severe, as treatments took effect, and as Whitmore learned to recognize and manage the impulses that had driven his predatory existence. London moved through its seasons, autumn giving way to winter, and Whitechapel continued its daily struggles, unaware that something that had hunted its streets now sat in rooms in Baker Street, learning to be human again, learning that even the most profound transformations might be addressed through patience and compassion, and the application of knowledge gathered from those who had faced similar challenges across time and distance. The 7 victims could not be restored. Their lives remained lost, but perhaps their deaths had served purpose beyond mere sustenance, had become catalyst for healing that might prevent countless future tragedies. And so, dear friend, we come to the end of our journey through foggy streets and dark cellars, through mysteries that challenged certainty, and through resolutions that offered hope alongside sorrow. As you drift towards sleep now, let yourself release the day's tensions. Let your breathing deepen and slow. Let your mind rest in the understanding that even the darkest mysteries can find resolution, that compassion and knowledge can transform what seems monstrous back toward humanity, that London sleeps peacefully tonight beneath her blanket of stars and clouds, her streets walked by ordinary people pursuing ordinary dreams. If you have found comfort in this tale, if it has helped ease you toward peaceful rest, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, leave a like to show your appreciation, and share your thoughts in the comments below. There are many more stories waiting to be told, many more mysteries to explore in that gentle space between waking and sleeping, where imagination and reality blur into dreams. Sleep well, dear listener, wherever you are in this vast world. May your rest be deep and undisturbed. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and ready for whatever adventures tomorrow brings. Until we meet again in another tale, another time, another journey through the shadows and the light. Good night, and let the gentle darkness carry you softly into sleep.